Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gents. This is Mr. Ayala with another vlog for you. This is Life Under Slavery and Abolition. So this is actually going to be split into two different vlogs. So just be aware of that because the amount of information is quite extensive. So to start with, let's look at our objectives. So you're going to be able to describe the average life of a slave during this time period. You'll be able to explain the causes and the effects of Nat Turner's Rebellion. You'll be able to explain both pro-slavery and anti-slavery arguments in the United States in the 1800s. And you'll be able to identify the important people and their contributions to the abolition movement. So quite a bit. So to start off, we're going to talk about African Americans in the South. So what happens in the South, the African American community is split into two different major groupings. The first one were the slaves and then the non-slaves. So the slaves themselves were split into multiple groups. So for example, you had plantation slaves, those who worked outside. And then you had others that were considered domestic servants or urban slaves who either worked in the plantation house or inside of urban areas like Charlestown or Atlanta. So a lot of these free slaves actually were treated extremely unfairly in this time period. Period. And so these free slaves or these free African Americans were treated so badly. Most of them actually end up moving up north or even to Canada, and it gets so bad that even some of the southern states themselves say that if you're an African American and you're freed, you're not even allowed to live in this state. So they actually kicked you out of that whole state, which is kind of ridiculous, but such is life at this time. So life under slavery, we have this because slavery becomes even a hotter topic during this time period. So we have rural slavery. So most of the time, men, women, and children worked from dawn to dusk, and the majority of these slaves lived on these large plantations. So most of the slaves during this time period who lived in the United States were slaves who lived in rural areas, who worked on plantations. Usually, you would get up before the crack of dawn, and you'd work all the way till dusk or till when the sun set. So they would work between 12 to 14-hour days. Then you had urban slavery. So the idea of the cotton gin, the wealth of cotton lured many white laborers from working in other fields. So what happens, all these white laborers from other fields decided that they wanted to become plantation owners because of the cotton gin. So skilled workers like carpenters, blacksmiths, etc. were in high demand. So slaves who worked in these urban environments and they had these skill sets actually had more freedom than those who worked in rural areas, but they didn't have any political rights. So even though they more or less had freedom of movement, because if you were an urban slave and let's say you needed to go get something for your master, they allowed you out and about to do your job, but you still had no political rights and you could be thrown into jail for something as silly as even looking at a white woman or being on the wrong side of the city or town at a certain time. The growth of slave culture. So first of all, African American and slave culture at this time really relied on strong religious convictions, close personal bonds, and the use of music to try to reduce the amount of stress and to make their living conditions less than horrible. They had these ideas of things like spirituals, which were used to express religion and or used for coded messages. So they would sing these religious spirituals as they were working as a way to pass time and to more or less say, hey, though I may be a slave in this life, in my next life I will be no one's slave. I will be free. And it was also a way to spread different codes. For example, if Harriet Tubman or other people on the Underground Railroad were in the area, this allowed them to say, hey, we can be freed, showed up at this time, make sure you're ready to go. So quite a few different reasons why these were used. Slaves were also separated from their families by being sold. And what happened is parents would try to protect their family members and their children. And the marriages that they had were not legally binding. So this actually allowed the slave owners to have more control. Because if you could threaten someone by separating their family, by separating their loved ones, they're more likely to comply than if you would just hurt them physically. Because a physical hurt may only last for a little bit of time. But when you tear apart that family structure and you say you can't see your husband, you can't see your children, this really affects people quite a bit and actually makes them easier to control. And so this was a major contentious issue between the slaveholders and the slaves themselves. So we get to Nat Turner's Rebellion. So he was a slave in Virginia, and he stated that he was chosen by God to free his people from bondage. He said that he was given ideas from God to be able to say, hey, my people should not be controlled by others, and I will lead them into the promised land. Sounds quite familiar to a lot of people who study civil rights and other major anti-slavery movements. So in August of 1831, Nat Turner leads a rebellion of 80 followers, and they attacked nearby plantations. So they end up killing approximately 60 white people and freeing their slaves. And though this ultimately failed, this puts the fear of God into these plantation owners, because they were like, you've got to be kidding me. Now, if they figure out that they outnumber the slaveholders, which they did, in South Carolina, the number of slave people outnumbered the number of slave owners. So just having people who could count could change everything. And because of Nat Turner's rebellion, Southerners in the antebellum, or what we'd call the pre-Civil War South, excuse me, I need to pick up a marker, begin to debate how to actually hold and control their slaves. Because if slaves could not be controlled, there were major issues. So in Virginia, some tried to get rid of slavery, period. They were just like, you know what, getting rid of slavery will completely get rid of this issue. And the slave owners were like, oh, heck no, I keep my slaves. No, they're mine. And in other southern states to try to control slaves, they actually instituted these things called slave codes, or laws to restrict slave movement and decrease the amount of freedom that these slaves had. So for a while, slaves were able to go visit each other on Sundays, because Sunday was under the Christian religion is considered a day of Sabbath. It's a day of relaxing and not having to work. These slaves, for a while, slave owners actually gave them the choice to go visit each other during these time, but they had to be back on the plantation at a certain time. But these slave codes more or less made it so that they had no freedom of movement, even with permission from their owner. And this becomes a major issue. One of the major slave codes, one of the most interesting ones I found, was that in South Carolina, if there was a puddle of water in the middle of the road and there's some white women wanted to try to get past, slaves literally had to lay down on the water and allow the white women to walk over them or around them because they didn't want to get their shoes wet. So this is ridiculous. When you talk about racism and you talk about the issues dealing with race and slavery, this is an exact example. Not any tiddlywinky thing. So the slave owners started to increase and say why they supported slavery. So we call these pro-slavery defenses. So these are reasons why Southerners really supported the idea of slavery. So the first thing is that they would cite the Bible or their religious text on why slaves should be slaves. So the most famous Bible passage that was cited was for servants to obey the masters. And because slave owners were considered masters, they're like, you must obey me because our religious text said so. One of the other pro-slavery arguments was slavery benefited blacks because it made them civilized and made them Christians. Not a very nice argument in my perspective. We had the myth of the happy slave, that African Americans loved being slaves because look how happy they are. They're always singing, when really that was a way just to get away from the horrors. They compared slavery to the horrible working conditions and to the factories in the North, and they're like, hey, at least slaves don't get their hand, mutilated by a factory or a piece of machine inside of a factory. They also used what they called the gag rule. to stop Congress from speaking about this issue. So this is the idea or concept that to suppress a discussion, you use the gag rule. So if I don't like something, they would say, hey, the gag rules in effect for that issue, as in you can't say anything or you will be thrown into jail.